These handsome outlaws, this duo right here, is Happy and Artie Traum. And if you've never heard of them, you probably have heard their work, which I'll get to in a second. This is their first album, first of three that they did together. Came out in 1969 on Capitol. That's a consensus of 69, and as you can see, that's clearly a 1969 Capitol Records label. These two, they started out in the Greenwich Village folk scene in the early 60s, Bob Dylan, Phil Oakes, all that, and eventually they got signed to Capitol and got to make this first album. As you can see, this is well loved. This copy, I'm not sure what WLVR was. I believe it was a student station somewhere, and someone there really liked this album. All great songs. So this is the first album. Now, the reason I bring this up, these guys were from Woodstock. They're brothers, obviously, and they're from Woodstock, and they worked with Bob Dylan, of course, the band. And the reason I know about this album is because I love the band. And right there, going down to see Bessie, Robbie Robertson, that's Bessie Smith. At the time this came out, the Basement Tapes hadn't been released yet, and that's another Basement Tape song, the Bessie Smith tune that leaked out and ended up on here. And as you can see, I'd never actually read through all of these and just realized that all but one of the other songs, was written by these two. So they're pretty excellent songwriters too. This is a great folksy album. I hate to use the word folksy, but I don't want to say folk rock, but it's just so soulful as far as folk goes. And this is the kind of thing that when people find folk music to be boring or preachy or whatever, I would say, well, listen to something like this, because this is not just about the message, and it's not just about musicianship. It's about everything. If you look at the names here, Charlie Talent, he worked with Gene Cotton, the Imperials, Mickey Newbury, all sorts of folks. For years, I thought that was Charlie Cailello, whatever his name is, however you pronounce it, who produced Laura Nero's first album, but it's clearly not the same guy. Eric Kaz, well known. He's got, I forget what his album on Atlantic that came out in 71 or 72 was, but that's a pretty great album. I think Bonnie Raitt's on that one. Bobby Thompson on drums. So you've got a lot of people. Kenny Buttrey. Oh, I never noticed that before. Got a lot of great players on this album. And this copy I found when I lived in New York City. After work, I would just go walk around forever. I didn't know what I was doing. I would just be walking the city. And one night I went into this record store, and it was like a typical Manhattan record store where it was kind of glitzy. There wasn't a lot of bargains to be had. It was all, new CDs and all that. But then they had a downstairs closeout room, I think they called it. So I went down there, and it was weird. It was it looked like the kind of room you'd rent for, a Cub Scouts meeting or a very low budget wedding reception. But down there, they had tons and tons of albums. I remember they had a bunch of sealed 45s. And by sealed, I mean, this is 45s that back in the day were cutouts from the late 60s, early 70s that nobody wanted anymore. They'd put a little bullet BB hole through the label, and then they'd put it in a plastic bag and seal it, sell them at Woolworths for $3 for $1. I found a bunch of Neil Diamond ones, I remember, on Uni. So those were some of his better ones. And I found this album, which I'd only heard tell of, but I finally had found it, and this was from WLVR, and as I mentioned, somebody loved it, and they marked it, and I can't think of a bad song on this disc. It's pretty great. So that's their first album. Their next album, next album I'd actually obtained first, Double Back. This is from 71. There they are again. And this one's a little bit slicker in the production. Capitol probably said you're too ragged on the first one. But clearly they're taking the band ethos with them. And again, Bearsville, Eric Kaz. Not a lot of players named on the back cover, but you've got this. Billy Mundy's name I see. Who else? Brad Campbell, Amos Garrett there on Jacksboro. Again, this has some excellent tunes. Very enjoyable. Bill Keith. And it came with this nice textured paper insert. And I got this at the sale of a public radio station just before I moved to New York City and found the first album. So I had this one, I liked it, and then when I found the second one, I had the second album. When I got the first one and found it, I was even more thrilled. And again, looks like they wrote most of these tunes on here. John Harold wrote a tune, and Tony Brown. But other than that, it's pretty much Happy and Artie. And I knew the names even before I'd read about them. I read about them in Greil Marcus's book, Mystery Train, which is a phenomenal book, in the chapter on the band, on covers of the band in the Basement Tapes. And I knew about these guys, actually before that, I knew about Happy because my first book that I was ever bought for when I was learning to play the guitar in 6th grade was from Happy Traum. And he actually for many years has made his sideline and probably his living with Homespun Tapes, it's called, because they originally were just done on his kitchen counter. These tapes where they would make a music book to learn from, and you would get a cassette or some sort of tape or a record or now a download or a CD with it. And that was a novel concept back then, and that's really how he's reached a lot more people with his music and his talents. So that's how I knew about him. And there's clearly a 1971 label. This is the same label that I've seen on Cahoots by the band, which came out in 71. The green label, which we saw a second ago, that's the one that I've seen on The Band from 69 and Stage Fright from 70. So all of this is lining up time-wise. And by the way, Artie Traum, another thing about him, this is why I said you probably know his work. He played with Bob Dylan on all of the new songs on Bob Dylan's Greatest Hits Volume 2, which is a double album. It's a great compilation, and there's, I think, a half dozen, maybe less, brand new songs on there. That's just him, Bob Dylan on acoustic guitar, and then Artie Traum on either bass or mandolin or something backing him up. They just went into the studio one day and just did it because Bob called him and said, I need help and I want to put these new songs on. And they were songs that at the time he had not released elsewhere. Dylan hadn't. So that's probably his most well-known recorded contribution. After this album, this one, Double Back, for 4 years, the band, Happy and Artie put out solo songs. He recorded with Bob Dylan, as I said. Happy recorded with Allen Ginsberg and Dylan on a session that's been bootlegged heavily. They wouldn't make another album together until 75, and it would be the last one together, Hard Times in the Country. And I just got this one. I didn't even know this existed until a few weeks ago. I always assumed they made the two Capitol albums and then went solo. And they've played on each other's albums in the solo years, but there's never been one credited to them aside from this, which I didn't know about. This is on Rounder Records, the great folk label, and this came out in 75. Oh, and look at that. They've even got Allen Ginsberg doing the notes here. And I've only listened to this one a little bit. I enjoyed it. It's got a lot of the same players. You see Billy Mundy's name on there yet again. And let's see who else. I almost thought this said Andy Rooney, because I saw Andy Robinson, Jim Rooney, Clark Pearson, Lorraine Grady Traum, must be the wife of one of them. So not as many well-known people on here, but it was pretty enjoyable. I think the first album I enjoyed the most, and the second's pretty good, and this one's just about as good as the second album. So I quite enjoyed it, and I recommend it, especially if you like the first two. But it's too bad that they never got to record anything else together. And the reason that I keep saying for sure that this is the final is because Artie passed away in 2008, which was unfortunate. So I remember I had a few requests for some of the music off the first two albums, which I digitized. So that was used then. But there's the label of the Rounder album. It was in nice shape when I got it. And this was right when Rounder was starting to get much bigger, just before they signed a band from Delaware, George Thorogood and the Destroyers. And, of course, their albums were more blues-based than folk, but they became big and then eventually signed to EMI America, and they put out Bad to the Bone, and I've never been able to forgive them ever since. So, nor should you. But if you really want a great album on Rounder, this one's pretty good, and the George Thorogood and Destroyers album with one bourbon, one scotch, and one beer, that's pretty excellent too, which is actually a medley of two songs, the way Thorogood put it together. But that is a classic, and that's definitely something that should be in your playlist. So getting back to Happy and Artie, there's Hard Times in the Country, 1975. There is Double Back, 1971. And the first album, Happy and Artie Traum. And I actually, about a year ago, found a copy of this in much better shape in a dollar bin at a normal record store. So the albums are out there. You'll be able to find them. I've never seen the other two. I've seen this one now twice. So you'll be able to track them down. And online, they're not that expensive. So I recommend you can go that route too if you want to hear some excellent music.